presentations didn't tell me, as somebody, as a homeowner, what is the trade-off cost between upgrading systems, putting in tanks and that sort of thing, and having the homeowner or group of homeowners or neighborhoods of homeowners get together and do these things. Is there any way that you could try to talk about that? Like, it sounded like Stratford was spending a heck of a lot of money per household for all of these upgrades to the 250-year storm, and maybe some more economical way could have been found, as was Saskatoon's idea of targeting specific areas.
Actually, before you guys answer, I'm just going to make sure the webcam, so the webcam gets the question. But is there a way to cost-benefit analysis of these kinds of initiatives for homeowners? Who would like to take it?
I can answer it. The City of London, when we did our case study analysis in the Sherwood Forest subdivision, we did look at that benefit, like between the pipe upsizing versus the homeowner.
2 million versus the
right, and so that was the difference that we found, was that the lot level control by taking the flow out of the system was going to cost 1/5 of what it would otherwise cost for us to upgrade or actually oversize the pipes to be able to accommodate that extra I&I.
Was that in a specific, what was the geographic area? That was just in that Sherwood Park area?
In this case, this was roughly 2,000 single-family unit homes. So you could extrapolate that out into larger areas.
And would that figure, the 20% figure savings that you had, could you generalize that to other areas, or was it very?
You could. We have other large areas that exhibit the same types of characteristics, where they have weeping tile connections and the same type of soil conditions and such. And we had, much like a lot of Toronto, I think showed it well with the development boom post-World War II. London was the same way. In the 50s to 70s and 80s, we had tons of infrastructure going in the ground, and all of that has the same characteristics of weeping tile connected to the sanitary, at least in London's case. And so the Sherwood Forest case wouldn't be unique to London. We could apply that, those same types of basement flooding mitigation issues to other subdivisions.
And certainly with regard to the city of Stratford, we did not choose to do pipes over other strategies. When we did our master plans, we looked at all the areas and looked at what would work in each areas, and we are implementing some of the same strategies in some areas, but the problem we had was the basin. And until we solve that problem, everything else would be moot.
Could I just take one more? Again, the city of Stratford's case too, I think, was primarily, if I'm not mistaken, a stormwater issue. The tanks I showed you to the city of Saskatoon is strictly sanitary sewer, so we're not dealing with stormwater flooding at all in that case. To answer your question, I think there's very little doubt that a homeowner-based strategy is the most cost-effective. If we could mandate to go in to homes and change all the plumbing, I think you would probably find, because as Kyle pointed out with the City of London, that if you can cut the problem off at the source, that solves all sorts of problems for you. And I think overall that's going to be the most cost-effective. It's a question more of implementation, and I'm not sure that every political climate's going to be a little different, but I would gauge the city of Saskatoon going in and mandating that people to do that to be met with a great deal of hostility in our case. And so the infrastructure problem is another solution to it. And as I pointed out, the dollar value is a little bit skewed. While you might be more cost effective to hit the homeowners that way, when you've got senior government funding giving you 50-cent and 33-cent dollars to build infrastructure with, that makes that more affordable in some cases to do the large infrastructure project. So that's the reason we've taken the route we have.
And I'll add another element of complication for you, because I can't help but think, for those of you in the audience today, you're completely confused, having seen different approaches and how the issues are being dealt with. And I think my take-home message to you is it isn't one size fits all, that you pretty much have to tailor-make the fix to fit the local conditions. And my point there is that You saw in the London case, and I think in Saskatoon, the foundation drains for the most part are connected to the sanitary sewer system. We've got that area that I showed in Toronto. It varies within even a neighborhood depending on how the builder configured the plumbing. There's situations where, you know, Weepers foundation drain is connected to the sanitary sewer system, and in the next neighborhood over, that same foundation drain is connected to the storm sewer system. And so when you think about complete isolation, it means severing off the storm connection to the foundation drain, as well as a backwater valve on the sanitary sewer system. Let me throw in another dimension of complication. If you're at the bottom of that soup bowl, you think about it, it's not uncommon to have several feet of water on your front lawn. So it doesn't matter what you've done, you're going to be flooded. Now, admittedly, if you've added a backwater valve or installed a backwater valve, it is, you know, rainwater when it's all said and done, but you're going to have a flooded basement. There's no denying that. So it's not one size fits all. You have to tailor it. You know, part of our analysis has been it's all of it. I mean, you need to deal with the storm drainage in the most effective way that you can, and to the extent that we can, because we can't be across the entire city. We need to do a much better job in getting the public, the residents, the homeowners, to do what they can to mitigate the impact as well.
Okay. Another question over here?
Yes, with the soup bowls, were those areas originally ponded or had streams going through them that had gone underground? So essentially it's originally a drainage problem. When you put development over it, you kind of covered up what was already there. Is that an issue?
So just for posterity, why do we have soup bowls, I guess is the basic question.
Yeah, I mean, when you take a look at it after the Second World War, I mean, development was just rampant. We just built houses as quickly as we could. We didn't sculpt the landscape as we do now to create the major system, the overland flow control that we've spoken about this morning. And you're absolutely right, but not, again, one size fits all. We had situations where there were old stream beds that ran through the North York area. And so yes, at the bottom of the soup bowl there would have been a stream, and in other cases that's just basically the topology of the area at the time. So in most cases I must say that it was as a result of some remnant drainage issue, swampy areas, old stream beds, but not in all cases.
Any other more questions? I'm going to go to the back.
I just wondered whether you could speak a little bit to what is being done in terms of consumer information, education on the topic, and in particular to the subsidies. How are consumers informed that they're available, and why do we need to do those things?
Okay, so again, we want to know about consumer education. How do people find out about the subsidies?
Yeah, in the City of London, it's certainly been a challenge to really get the homeowner even interested enough to take a look at what we have to offer. In the Sherwood Forest case, we've really hit them hard with homeowner education stuff. We've done 2 pretty comprehensive surveys, and the ICLR survey that they administered, they physically went door to door and to get the survey information out of the people. Again, it's an issue of the majority of the people, or many of the people, have dry basements, and therefore they have, in our experience, little to no interest in what's going on under the ground and what they could do to help the overall system, because it's not impacting them. And so the people that do have wet basements are much more willing to listen and hear what we have to offer. And so we have done, in the Sherwood Forest case, for example, we've done subdivision-wide mail-outs. With our pamphlets and information, we also held, at the end of 2009, a public meeting. So we send out a letter to all the residents, and we put in bold lettering, even if you don't have basement flooding, we want you to come out and hear what we have to say and what's available. That particular meeting, we had 73 properties show up out of a mail-out of 2,000. So take from it what you will, I guess. We were told that was pretty good turnout, but you know, it could have been a lot better. So it's a challenge.
I would echo most of that. If there was, I wrote an article shortly after the June 29th event, and I said that if I had wanted to hold a public meeting about sewer systems and what you can do to protect your house prior to any of our flooding events, I wouldn't have needed a very big room to hold the meeting in, because there's absolutely no public interest. But the second you have a major event like this, you certainly, public interest peaks immediately. And so this is certainly a case with advertising and trying to get information out that timing is everything, because once one of these things happen, all of a sudden everybody's interested in it, and that's certainly been our response as well. As far as the question was about determining who was on the program, getting it out to them. In our case, it wasn't a question of homeowners volunteering. We determined you were on the program and we sent you a package directly. And that was as a result of where we knew basement flooding had occurred, and we determined what homes had either reported it or what homes we deemed were vulnerable, just simply because perhaps one home on either side of them had flooded. And so we would send the homeowner in the center make them part of the program as well, and try to keep these zones contiguous, I guess. So.
Give you a bit of a Toronto perspective, because we've been at it probably, well, we'll say for a very long time. Back in 2005, as you can appreciate, I can't tell you the number of meetings that we attended. It's not too dissimilar to some of the slides that you saw. I mean, they're about as irate a group that you would ever encounter. That aside, and we packed the council chambers, absolutely packed. That aside, what we did strategically do is make sure that we had staff available, not too dissimilar to have a display like the mainline backwater valve there, so that the residents could touch and feel this thing, that it wasn't a mystery. And we could explain to them how it worked, and that they would be well advised to take us up on the offer that the city was providing, up to 80% of the cost to an upset limit of. Further to that, the most basic measure was the disconnection of downspouts. We had a booth set up, to show them how you could, and at that time the City of Toronto offered, without charge, a free disconnection of downspouts. We were paying an exorbitant rate because you have to go through our procurement process and making sure that it's properly inspected and proper controls in place. But that aside, the uptake was absolutely pathetic. To this day, the numbers in terms of the uptake on the mainline valve, the subsidy, have increased. I think last year we were about 600, the year before 400. So we've ramped up about 200 a year, and I think the forecast for this year is about 800. Mindful of the fact that we had over 4,000 basements flooded back in 2005, and you have long histories of neighborhoods that have had basement flooding problems. To me, those numbers are pretty low. When you take a look at those communities where we have those big pipes I showed, the message is getting through. So when I walk through that community now, delighted to see that most of the downspouts are disconnected, and they've heeded the advice to extend the roof leader well away from the foundation walls. But the backwater valve, unless they're putting them in without seeking a subsidy from the city, the uptake is still nowhere near what it should be.
Okay. And question over here?
Actually, you were just touching on what I was going to ask about. I've sort of looked at this, and a lot of the municipalities are offering these subsidies now, and they seem to be in an upper limit range of sort of the $2,000 to $3,000 range. I don't know if that's correct. Now, I don't know if any of the panelists have actually looked at the actual cost, because intuitively I would think it would be, that might be part of the resistance. I think it would be substantially more than that amount, particularly with a lot of people having finished basements and so forth nowadays.
Okay. The question is, how does the subsidy, what percentage of the subsidy?
Yeah, how does it really compare to the actual cost, and is that possibly contributing to the resistance?
Go ahead.
Sure. I'm anxious to answer this one because I know this problem intimately. In fact, that was one of the resistances we had, of course, as people said, oh, this is not going to be nearly enough money. I'll tell you the city of Saskatoon example, and I appreciate that other municipalities and plumbing situations would be different. We had, and this is the procedure we went through, we have about 150 licensed plumbers in the city of Saskatoon that would do this sort of work. We went to every single one of them and ask, are you interested in being on this program or not being on, being involved in this program? You didn't have to sign up to participate. But what we would do is we would supply everybody who got a package with a list of plumbers that said, we are interested in doing this work, give us a call. And so their name and address and contact information is all on there. So every homeowner got a list of about 30 plumbers that said, yeah, we'll do this work. What we found was that if you had a large plumbing institution doing it, the ones that do all the advertising on the radio and stuff like that, they would take the subsidy cost and they would add $800 on it, and that would be the price. And when we moved it up to $3,000, it moved up $800. Okay? And so the smaller plumbing firms that were on there, some of them were just sole proprietors, and other things like, you know, maybe had a couple of people working for them, maybe weren't as large. Their subsidy cost, when we got the receipt in, it was $2,500, 00. They'd worked out the PST and the GST exactly, so it came up to $2,500. We found, our experience, if I can recall my statistics correctly, about 40% of the people opted to go for the smaller plumbing firms and therefore had exactly the subsidy rate when it came in. I would say about 60% went with the name they knew and can trust off the radio, and as a result, they paid a premium above that. And so we kept very accurate statistics, because we had every invoice, there's no reason we couldn't, on how much people paid. And so that was the situation which we found. We found that all 3 years we ran the program.
And that's the cost for the backflow valve and a sump?
Yeah, backwater valve and a sump pit with a disconnect.
Surprising.
If I can comment for Toronto, when we established the subsidy value, it was based for an unfinished basement, right? You had to cap it at some level, 80% of the cost of an install for an unfinished basement. Yeah, well, and so the other thing too that we need to be mindful of, one of the lessons learned at our end, because we would, you'd have property owners that installed them, and only to find that they claimed that they had installed it, but they didn't install what in Ontario is the Ontario Building Code approved, and that's the mainline valve which you see at the back of the room. They would have installed a product that they picked up at their local hardware store, which did meet the test from a hydrostatic pressure standpoint, number one. Number two, as we found over time, is that the plumbing, the drain configurations in these houses varies from one house to the next. So where a plumber may have installed the main line valve at the front end, at the most exit point of the house, only to find that the foundation drains are connected to that main line in the interior. And so that when you've got hydrostatic pressure built up around the foundation wall, you've got now sewage backups, flow backup in their basement. And so the complaint was, well, I put a backwater valve in, I installed it and did all of this, but I've got a backup. The other thing that I need to mention is that in our program, and I suspect for other municipalities, and one of the things maybe why the uptake isn't where it is that we force them to go through and seek a plumbing permit from the city, because we want to make sure that the money invested by the city is well spent, that it is properly inspected so that it is installed correctly.
Question at the back?
I'm just wondering, when the weeping tile is connected to the actual drain, you can disconnect and put it into a sump pump. When they're connected actually over in front of the home, the cost I found nearly doubled. Did you have similar experiences and how do you deal with that situation?
Okay. So when the weeping tile is in front of the house, the cost is much, much higher. Any other municipalities that had experience?
I would just quickly comment, I'm not familiar with that situation at all. In Saskatoon, the work we've done, it's all been strictly through the floor drains. That was just building practice at the time. So I appreciate that it probably would be more expensive. That's just not something we've experienced.
And if there was an actual physical disconnect, I guess it would be loose in the interior drain.
Yeah, you would take normally, unlike the city of Toronto, we allow two things. We would allow what we call, we term a normally open valve, which is the one you see at the back and the one I showed in my presentation. That's becoming more common. We also have what are called normally closed valves, which you put on branch lines. So typically, a typical installation would be a basement that had a floor drain that was connected in the basement and perhaps a bathroom group. The plumber would come in, they would bash two holes in, they'd bash one at the floor drain and one at the bathroom group, put what we term a normally closed valve in both of those locations. And because they took the concrete out next to the floor drain, they would make the disconnect from the weeping tile at that point by the floor drain. 2 feet away, they would bash in a sump pump and put those two connections straight into there.
We had a question right at the back.
Sorry, my question was about the class action suit. Did you ever get what was the reasoning behind the them to take any action by law hold harmless.
So the question was about how do you protect yourself from the class action lawsuits?
The reasoning behind the certification I'm curious about.
And why it was certified in the town?
Well, the claim against the city is that we're reliable in this area, that our services were undersized and we had allowed development to take place without taking those into account. And of course, our position was we couldn't figure out from the data, no matter how extensively and who we hired to do it exactly what size the storm it was, but we were able to establish it was well above a 100-year storm and could even conceivably be a 450-year storm. So it was huge, and that was our defense with regard to that. So in the end, we just took a look at how much we had spent on legal fees, just getting to the certification stage, how much we would have to pay in the future. So through a mediation process, we agreed to give them a check for $7.7 million to the firm. They dealt with everybody. We were out of it. We had no admission of liability, and we were, everything to do with that action was resolved, and no more liability could come to the city. That does not prevent us from liability for future events.
Next, over here.
Is there anything in the municipalities or federal government to initiate a program for stormwater storage for new homes or retrofit existing homes, not water to be used for gray water within the house?
Are you referring to internally within homes?
Yes.
Yeah, I've taken a little, well, from a cost benefit perspective of a homeowner, like retrofitting and gray water reuse in your home is very cost prohibitive. And I guess the important thing to note on that is the gray water you reuse, our issues with flooding aren't related to dry weather sanitary flows, i.e. like the flows from your toilet or your shower or your washing.
It's mostly about storage of stormwater. By putting this now into a cistern, it's not going into your drainage system. That water now is being reused in the house.
Yeah, and in a smaller case, even putting rain barrels in, to collect that stormwater flow from roofs and such. Ultimately, again, you get to a certain size storm event that overwhelms that, and in the case of rain barrels, they can fill up very, very quickly. And cisterns or such, depending on how big you make them, they can still be overwhelmed. You're still left dealing with that stormwater flow.
So just the city of Saskatoon, what do you do with the water in the sacrificial basements?
It gets pumped. The water that goes into the super pipes gets pumped out back into the sanitary sewer immediately after the event. So it's a one-shot deal. It fills up, and then you empty it after that. As far as I agree with Kyle. It's a question of magnitude. Unfortunately, most of the homeowner scale projects for stormwater management is too small and of an amount compared to the amount of stormwater that would be generated in an entire city to make a significant difference, particularly in very large events. So nothing against rain barrels and the benefits you might see from that, but from a stormwater management perspective, it isn't. It just doesn't add up to quite enough to make a difference.
Another one over here.
In your opinion, how much of the uptick in frequency and severity of these basement floods would you attribute to climate change as opposed to just general population growth, growth in the number of houses using these systems, and then just inflation of those houses being worth more in the last, say, 10 years?
So the question is about what's the cause of the increase in basement flooding, climate change, inflation, population growth?
I'll just I'm sorry I didn't quite catch all that question. Regarding development, and I'm sure most of the other municipalities are the same way, we have a very strict policy in Saskatoon that they cannot have a negative impact on existing infrastructure systems. And once again, they often get blamed. We had one of the areas where we got a lot of sanitary sewer flooding. There was a new neighborhood development going on, to the north of them. And that was an immediate thing that people pointed the fingers at. They said, that's the cause, because I didn't have flooding, up to 2004. And in 2004, that's when you started putting houses in there. And now all of a sudden I'm seeing flooding. The two things were completely unrelated, though. It's coincidental. Those two things occurred at the same time. In that particular case, the subdivision that they were pointing the finger at had a lift station that pumped the sewage, 4 kilometers away to a completely different system than the one that had flooded. And so the development issue, at least in Saskatoon, is we're very careful not to overlap those things. And indeed, what we're seeing now is with new development, we're piggybacking improvements in the new development. For example, we put 2 super tanks in new development areas adjoining areas that flooded. Okay? So that infrastructure is actually in the adjoining neighborhood, okay? But we've piped it in such a way that it can influence the neighborhood beside it. Okay? So the 2 systems are separate, but because there's greenfield development, instead of ripping up asphalt, we go right on the border and we put the pipes in, the super pipes in there. So as much as possible, we try to make the development process improve the situation rather than contribute to it. So.
I guess the only comment I want to make is one of my earlier slides where I had those red bars. There's no question that certainly in a Toronto context, we're getting hit by these extreme storms more frequently than we have in the past. The other point that I need to make, and the climatologist can't explain it, why is it that the north end of the city of Toronto is being impacted more frequently than the south end? We have had the odd storm in the south end, but nowhere near the frequency that we've had in the north end. And again, I want to emphasize a completely separated storm sanitary sewer system being hit by storms well in excess of at that time, the conventional design standards.
Sorry, just one final point. I've seen the same thing in the city of Saskatoon. We have a rain gauge network. There's one area of the city that has been pounded. All of those storm events I showed you came from the west side of the city, north, east sides of the city, not nearly the same values.
I do have a question. I'm kind of curious. A lot of developers actually set the foundation in the wintertime, and winter and cold will actually prevent the cement from drying up because it has to heat up and dry up in order for not to be any cracks. So would that be, I'm not sure if you guys did any sort of research, but foundation-wise new developments have, because there's a lot of new developments that do end up flooding, not because they're connected to sewer, but maybe because they have cracks to the foundation, and maybe there's a correlation with homes being built or setting the foundation in the wintertime.
My only comment to that is in Toronto, I think I've been hearing from all the other speakers, the field of stormwater management has evolved over time. We don't allow any new connections to our storm sewer system, no storm laterals. So it's a sump pump and discharge typically to grade, typically to the backyard as opposed to the front yard. So the problems that we're seeing sort of manifested themselves a long history of, so I don't think it has anything to do with where the foundations were set or how they were poured. The fact is that you had this extra stormwater making its way into the sanitary sewer system.
Go back.
In the Sherwood Forest neighborhood, did you do any post-rehab flow monitoring to see what your reduction was?
That's our intention. We haven't actually gone through the mandatory weeping tile disconnects at this point, but short answer is yes. We'll be monitoring that and actually evaluating the actual impact.
Others?
Do you run into problems such as people saying, well, originally you took my water away, now you want me to disconnect my downspout and dump my water on my own property. How is this going to help me? You're not essentially doing your job. Is that one of the major problems you have in that sort of environment? And how do you get around that?
So homeowner perception of what the role of the municipality is. Are they doing their job?
There's a whole other talk that I give in regards to water pollution and stormwater runoff combined sewer overflow. So the south end of the city is serviced by combined sewers, and I didn't touch on it in my presentation for brevity purposes, but there's no disputing the fact that stormwater, even from a roof area, and stormwater entering in our road network is polluted, and we need to deal with it. And that's a huge other program in the city of Toronto. When you couple now, when you layer on that the impact of the flow volume, and again, in Toronto, in the cases that I spoke about, you've got that roof area that's directly connected to our storm sewer system. One of the things that I glossed over is the fact that under these extreme storms, that storm sewer system is pressurized. We typically have the sanitary lateral and the storm lateral servicing a given house, typically in the same trench. The minute that that storm sewer is pressurized, it will force water into the sanitary lateral because the joints aren't watertight, and it exacerbates the problem. So by removing that extra storm water from all of those roof areas in a given neighborhood, it basically reduces the hydraulic grade line in the storm sewer, which is really what we want to achieve. We want that gravity flow as opposed to pressurized flow. So once you begin to explain it to these communities, you know, through the environmental assessment process in Ontario, you're out in the public several times through the process and looking at different options so that you can get the community engaged to select the preferred. And in our case, it became paramount that we did that because we put a lock on in regards to putting a tank or a pond in their local community park, and it was a small park, and it was the only park, the only open space that we had available to put in these oversized pipes that we saw. So once the community has an understanding of what the problem is, and the simple fact that disconnecting their downspouts not only helps them, but also helps the entire community. It's almost a bit of peer pressure that we saw built up into those communities. And like I said, you know, several years later, to walk into the community that, for the most part, was completely connected to the storm sewer system is now, for the most part, completely disconnected. I think it's just public education is key.
Mr. Don?
Were you able to say to the 50% of people that didn't opt in to putting in a backwater valve, you are at enhanced risk of flooding because the rest of your neighbors, the other half of your neighbors, have done so? Would that have any impact on take-up of a plan to put in these sort of measures?
You'd think it would. You know, I've seen instances where, with those two storms I showed you on my graph there, we had one on June 17th, 2007. There were people that diligently went and ripped out all the wet carpet and wet gyp rock in their basement and got new appliances and a new water heater and a new furnace and everything else that they needed to do, only to have all of that new stuff destroyed again less than 2 months later on August 17th. And in fact, I got called to a meeting where this was probably the scariest one. The citizens called a meeting and told us to come and where to show up. So that was an interesting experience. But what astonished me is that you would spend this amount of money and go to this much trouble, and while the basement is ripped up, you wouldn't go and put a backwater valve in. It defies logic, I suppose, you know, being an engineer and being someone who's exposed to this all the time, it's obviously very close to what I've been thinking about all the time. So to me, that would be a no-brainer that you would go and do this. But, you know, and it's not like we didn't try public education, and it's not like we didn't try to provide as much information to all of the homeowners that flooded about, you know, what had happened and what you could do on your property to prevent this. But for some reason, there are people that just simply won't take it up. I mean, to their credit, some people did, 50%, but there are other people, for whatever reason they have, just don't want to be part of it.
And London's experience really echoes that. We didn't even get 50%. I mean, Sherwood Forest is a perfect example of, we had over 100 people physically call the city to report flooding after that one storm. And in our experience, many more people didn't call the city and would have got flooded. And you know, you would think that you would get a lot of people then signing up for the grant program, but I mean, we've had less than 24 people. So you know, you're talking like maybe 10–15% uptake, and these are people that physically got flooded and couldn't see it. But and I think that survey results from ICLR, I think they really tried to figure out why people have this perception and view, and why don't they want to get a backwater valve. And you know, there are a lot of ranging different answers from people thinking that it's a one-time event and okay, I got flooded, that was my one time, now I can rebuild the basement and everything will be fine again. But
What if they find out that their insurance coverage is going to be reduced?
well, and we have that where people have made multiple claims and then now they don't have sewer backup coverage. And now they're in a bit of a tough situation because now they can't get coverage.
So, actually, can I just, I've waited my turn, I would like to ask a question. My question in general has a bit changed this time. The three pieces of information that insurers ask ICLR about tend to be maps. So I'm going to ask a three-part question. But number one is, you talked about soup bowls. And every one of you has, throughout the morning, one of the commonalities that we heard from municipalities was, you know in your neighborhood where the soup bowl is, and who's at the edge of the soup, and who's at the bottom of the bowl. Is there a way to communicate that? And do you communicate that to anyone? So that's part one, and I have
To the homeowners?
to city council, to insurers, is there a map that exists in the city that we could freedom of information request or an insurer could go and look at?
From the City of London, we don't want to actually publicly pinpoint specific properties. People do have a concern with property value of their house, and so that is a concern too. Some people are actually reluctant to admit that they've had basement flooding because they're worried about the resale value on homes. And who would want to buy my house if they know that I have a wet basement? So I think we'd be somewhat reluctant to actually publish, okay, these 6 houses on this street are in a bad spot. But certainly we do identify more generalized areas and subdivisions which are at increased risk or exposure to basement flooding.
That's what I thought you were going to say.
What I can add to that is because of the situation in Stratford, it's well publicized where we have this basin, and part of our due diligence when we went through the suit was we tracked the property values, and the property values, despite all the publicity, were not any more adversely affected than anywhere else, interestingly enough. Generally, people that talk to us have said, it's the state's responsibility, and we've tried to take our time to try to explain to them that our responsibility is this far, and your responsibility is here. But it's always a very difficult conversation, and despite all of that, and us going through the programs and the incentives, some people have willingly done it, and other people steadfastly refuse. I can't explain it beyond that.
I'll make a couple of quick comments here. I guess from the City of Saskatoon's standpoint, we're very cognizant of privacy information for a homeowner. And so if a homeowner has told us, they flooded or they're part of this program or they've got plumbing permits, the homeowner has the right to look at any of that information for their home if they are the owner of that piece of property. We don't divulge that to other people. For instance, I'd have a real estate agent call me and, hey, such and such a house called? And I said, well, the homeowner is somebody that I will talk to about that property and anything specific to that property. But if somebody else, a second party, a neighbor, anybody else wants to know, no, there's a privacy issue here which we keep very close. And so we only divulge those things to homeowners. So I'll point out one other thing here as a confession. What you saw with that neighborhood on my presentation, that was a fake. Okay, so that is the sort of thing that we did. We do that sort of information and do that sort of engineering for all those neighborhoods, but I quite deliberately took a neighborhood that did not flood in Saskatoon, and I put those same sorts of pieces of information that I would have done had I shown you the actual thing. But that was quite deliberate because I don't want to show what homes flooded because of that privacy information situation that we have in Saskatoon.
That'll get you banned from Oprah. My next question has to do.
Sorry, just to add, I think a lot of the audience is from Toronto, so we're perhaps a little more transparent. The slide that I showed with those 32 study areas is on our website. If you drill down, there's I think it's the engineering report update on basement flooding. and it's in the staff report. And the point there is not only for council's benefit, to give them an appreciation of just how widespread the problem is. There are areas that literally lit up like a Christmas tree on August 2005, and so they were the first priority. We've gone through and prioritized the work in accordance with the impact that was felt. There's a schedule, a table, and yes, it's not at down to a street level resolution in terms of the mapping, but it's sufficient enough to get a sense of the neighborhoods that were impacted.
One last question.
Sure. I work for the City of Toronto in the Toronto Environment Office, and for about 4 years we've been extensively involved in looking at some of the climate science. And I think that in addition to basement flooding, we've got an awful lot of other risks in our urban areas. We think specifically about roads, we can think of public health, we can think of public transit, we can think of our parks and our green spaces. There's many things at risk. And I think one of the parts of the equation that's missing here is an appreciation of how our world is changing around us. And the public is not understanding that. The public in these soup bowls that are getting flooded out, they have a narrow vision that it rained, that was too bad, maybe it won't happen again. And so the question of the panel, is there a validity to trying to get better climate science out there? I'm going to tell you, yesterday I was with the Toronto Climate Change Science Advisory Committee. I'll tell you that that group is very underfunded. We can't get people to do the science. We know what more needs to be done. There are struggling groups at universities that want to do more work, and they're underfunded. There's a starved situation of climate scientists in Canada due to cutbacks. Those people are moving away. We cannot find a postgraduate student to do the work. Right now, we're struggling to even update what have been the trends in the last 30 years in Toronto. I'm going to tell you right now that the trends that we're going to get soon is only for up to the year 2000, and it totally excludes 2000 to 2010, where all the records have been smashed, because we can't get the funding for the people to do that. And so, and then therefore we can't communicate like what New York City has done, where they've got a consensus document from all the top scientists. The science is done. Same thing in the UK. The science is done to the best of their ability. So I'm telling you, there's a knowledge deficit there that could be improved. I think that there's a knowledge deficit out there amongst the consumers or homeowners or residents. And so I'm asking the panel, what do you think of that? That's my view. What do you think?
Right now, the city of Saskatoon, actually, as we speak, this year, has partnered with researchers at the University of Saskatchewan just to find out if there's any validity to changing our IDF curves that we usually have been using up to this point, and to see if, is there enough evidence to suggest that those IDF curves should move. I'll wait to see what their response is. My reaction is probably not, just because they usually go back for such an extendedly large period of time, that the storms that we have are likely not going to affect that sort of analysis a lot. It's a tough sell, because not only have we had, as I showed, 4 of the wettest 10 years, if I'd extended my time frame up to 2001, I would have included 2 of the driest years in history as well. So you might make an argument maybe that's just more fluctuations occurring, which I suppose may be valid. I guess from our standpoint, that's something we want to revisit and reinvestigate. I think my concern right now would be not so much the change in the IDF curves as it would be how are we going to take into account these contributing factors, like I showed you, where you have a very wet year and how that affects your rain, how the impact that a storm has. What happens when you have 2 storms in a row? What are the odds of that sort of thing happening? So those are, it's a little different problem than a strict hydrology problem, which often climate change climate change scientists are trying to focus in on, as opposed to this sort of unique urban situation that we go out and trying to understand it better. And it may very well be changing, or has changed since we've started designing it, but I guess that's just something we're still investigating and trying to figure out.
Okay, I'm going to close this session and direct you to lunch.